Snow fell that night as though heaven itself wished to bury the earth in silence. It came soft at first, a drifting lace across the prairie, then thick and endless, whitening the roofs of cabins, the rickety fences, the narrow street of the small western town. But the hush of winter did not hide the sound that split through it, a whip striking flesh, sharp as a gunshot. That sound carried farther than words, farther even than the wind, and it landed in the heart of a child. She was no more than 4, small and thin, her bare feet half hidden in snow. She stood in the yard, her breath trembling, her voice trying to rise against the storm. "Mama, stop hurting Mama." Her cry was broken, not because she lacked strength, but because she had already learned how little the world listened to small voices. Her cheeks burned red from cold, her hands tucked against her mouth, as if trying to hold back the ache of watching. The man wielding the whip was not yet old, but cruelty had hardened his features far beyond his years. His 37 winters had carved lines into his face, his eyes narrow as though always measuring, always finding fault. He had built his authority not on kindness but fear. His hand, strong from field work, now struck with something close to pleasure. Snow clung to his hair, to the leather of his coat, but he did not notice. His rage burned hotter than the storm. And she, the young wife, knelt in that snow. Her dress, dark green and torn at the sleeve, hung heavy with frost. At 24 she was still beautiful, her face carrying a quiet grace, but the world had weighed her down with burdens no woman should bear. Her belly curved forward, heavy with new life, yet she bore her punishment with bowed head and silence. She did not scream. She did not beg. Her silence was not weakness, it was defiance, the only defiance left to her. For if she cried, he would strike harder. If she resisted, he would not stop until she fell. The whip cracked again. The child's cry rose, thin and desperate. The mother lifted her eyes for only a moment, enough for the girl to see them. Dark eyes steady, sorrowful, but still alive. That glance was all the comfort the child would be given. It was enough to keep her standing, though her knees shook. The snow muffled most things, but cruelty cannot hide. From the far edge of town, a man sat astride a horse and watched. He was younger than the one with the whip, broader of shoulder though not proud in his stance. His coat was plain, his hat pulled low against the snow. He was known to few, spoken of less, for he kept to himself on the ranchland miles beyond the settlement. His life had been marked by silence, and silence he wore like second skin. Yet as he watched that scene unfold, something stirred within him. It was not rage, his was not the nature to burn quickly. It was not pity either, for pity can be cruel in its own way. It was a steady knowing, the kind that settles into a man's bones and does not leave. He turned his horse aside, as though unwilling to linger on another's suffering, yet the image followed him. The child crying in the snow, the woman kneeling with the whip's mark hidden beneath her dress. The sound of leather striking would live in his mind long after the storm had passed. Inside the cabin, when the punishment ended, the man dropped the whip by the door as though it were no more than a tool. He poured himself whiskey with hands that shook not from guilt but from drink. The young woman rose slowly, her breath tight, her back aching where the lash had bitten. She drew her daughter close, pressing the child's face against her own chilled skin. She whispered words no one else could hear, words that tasted of comfort, not complaint. Then she guided the little girl to bed, her own body swaying like a tree bent too far by the wind. The fire in that house burned low. No warmth touched its walls. Yet the snow outside glowed with a strange brightness under the moon, as though promising something beyond suffering, something still hidden. The days that followed carried the same silence. The townfolk had seen, or heard, or chosen not to notice. Neighbors glanced quickly when she passed, averted their eyes when the man spoke. They muttered among themselves that it was not their place to meddle, that a man ruled his household as he saw fit. Their silence was its own whip, striking just as sharply, leaving scars that did not show. And yet the child remembered. She remembered the way her cry had pierced the snow, how the world had not answered, how her mama had looked at her without words. That memory sat in her small chest like a stone. At night she lay close to her mother, whispering promises that children cannot keep. "I'll protect you, I'll make it stop." The mother listened, stroked her daughter's hair, and hummed a tune that belonged to gentler days. Far out on the land, the rancher carried wood into his cabin. He stoked the fire until it burned bright, yet even in the warmth he saw snow still falling in his mind. He had not interfered. That knowledge pressed heavy against him. His silence felt heavier than the logs in his arms. The prairie was wide, the winter merciless, but cruelty in men was the harshest weather of all. One morning, as snowflakes drifted lazy and soft, he saw her again. She walked slowly through the store, carrying her daughter's hand in one and a basket in the other. Her step was careful, her back held stiff, though no one spoke of the pain that caused it. She tried to lift a sack of flour, too heavy for her slight frame. It slipped, near to falling, before a steady hand caught it. She looked up, startled. The rancher did not speak, only set the sack into her basket with quiet ease. Their eyes met for a moment. She saw no judgment in his, no hunger, no curiosity. Only the kind of strength that does not need to be proven. She lowered her gaze, murmured a thank you too soft for others to hear, and went on her way. The child peeked at him from behind her mother's skirt. Her eyes were wide, curious, remembering perhaps that this was the man who had looked when no one else did. She pressed her small hand against the frosted window of the store as they left, leaving a print that melted almost at once. The rancher stood still, watching the mark fade. It left behind nothing visible, yet it lingered as though etched into the glass of his heart. That night the storm grew fierce again. Snow swept across the prairie in sheets, rattling at windows, piling against doors. Inside his cabin, the rancher sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The world outside howled and screamed, but within he heard only one sound, the cry of a child echoing through the snow. It had not been his child. It had not been his wife. And yet it had become his burden, as sure as the land was his to tend. The storm raged on. In the cabin where the whip still lay by the door, the young woman held her daughter close, singing low, though her own voice was hoarse with exhaustion. She sang not to erase the pain but to keep hope alive a little longer. For in a world so vast and cruel, sometimes hope is the only shield left. And somewhere beyond the howling winds, a man who had long lived alone felt that same fragile flame beginning to stir inside his chest. Snow softened the edges of everything, hiding the sharp lines of fences, quieting the ruts in the street, even veiling the cracks in men's hearts. But it could not hide the bruises on a young woman's soul, nor could it hush the memory of leather splitting the cold night air. She moved about her days as though the world had not witnessed, her back straight, her head bowed just enough to avoid stares. Her daughter clung to her hand, a small shadow of trust and fear, her steps light in the snow but her eyes heavy with worry. The man of the house, the one who should have been protector, carried himself with the swagger of one convinced his power was untouchable. In saloons he laughed loud, his voice spilling whiskey and bravado. He spoke of his land, his control, his right to command. Men listened because men often prefer the company of strength, even when that strength is rotten. Yet when he passed through town with his wife at his side, eyes followed with unease. Everyone knew, but no one interfered. Silence had become the town's pact with itself. The rancher lived apart, beyond the last row of cabins, where open fields met rolling white drift. He kept few words, fewer friends, but his work was honest and his life steady. Each morning he broke the ice from the water troughs, fed his horses, split wood until his arms ached. He asked nothing of others and offered little, not because he lacked generosity but because solitude had grown into his skin. He had lost things once: people, home, perhaps even the kind of hope that comes easy to the young. What remained was a quiet endurance, a steady rhythm of survival. Yet even in his solitude he carried images that disturbed his rest. The sight of a woman kneeling in snow, her child crying at her side, returned to him each night. It would rise unbidden when he was mending a fence or setting logs on the fire, as if the memory itself demanded recognition. He tried to push it aside, but compassion, once stirred, cannot be drowned in silence. One afternoon, the wind cut sharp across town as she entered the store again. The bell above the door jingled weakly, and she guided her daughter to the stove near the counter where warmth lingered. Her face was pale, lips tight, but her hands worked with practiced care as she chose what little she could afford: flour, a strip of cloth, salt. The child trailed her, running a finger across the shelves, wide-eyed at the jars of candy she knew better than to ask for. The rancher was there as well, buying nails and lamp oil. He kept his hat low, speaking few words to the shopkeeper. But when he turned, he saw her struggling to lift another sack, heavier than her frame should bear. Without hesitation, he crossed the floor. His hands were steady, roughened by years of work, but gentle as he lifted the weight with ease and set it down where she needed. Their eyes met again, and this time the moment lasted longer. There was no conversation, no gratitude beyond the briefest nod, but something passed between them, an acknowledgment, quiet yet unshakable. The child watched, her small face studying him as though measuring whether he was a man to be feared. She did not shrink back. That, too, was a kind of answer. Word of these small moments traveled through town as whispers. People noticed when the rancher offered his hand, when the young woman allowed it. Some frowned, some pitied, some warned among themselves that such kindness would earn him trouble. Still, the rancher did not draw back. He did not speak of it to anyone, but within himself he knew, respect shown to one who has known little can be a form of rebellion, and he had never been afraid of rebellion when it was just. At home that evening, she sewed quietly by the hearth while her daughter played at her feet with scraps of cloth, fashioning them into dolls with a child's imagination. The fire cracked, casting shadows across her weary face. She thought of the man at the store, the way he had not looked at her with pity or with want, but simply as if she deserved help. That thought lingered long after the stitching was done, and though she tried to brush it away, her heart ached not from danger but from a long-forgotten taste of dignity. The man who shared her roof noticed none of this. He drank, spoke harshly, let his temper ride unchecked. His moods came like storms, and she endured them as one endures weather, knowing no prayer can halt the thunder. But each day his shadow seemed darker, each word more bitter, as though the sight of her very endurance enraged him further. The child grew restless, sensing more than she understood. At night she would ask her mother questions with a seriousness beyond her years. "Why is Papa angry? Why do you hurt? Why did no one come when I cried?" Her mother would hush her with soft strokes of hair, but each question carved deeper into her silence. She could not answer because the truth, that the world often turns away from pain, was too heavy a truth to place on a child's shoulders. Meanwhile, the rancher returned to his land, but each night the image of the girl's small hand pressed against frosted glass haunted him. It seemed to him a call for help, though unspoken. He began to notice the snow differently. Each flake, cold and fleeting, seemed a reminder of fragility. Yet snow when gathered could blanket the land, soften its edges, protect the soil beneath. He wondered if kindness, gathered in such measure, could protect hearts as well. When the paths of their lives crossed again, it was not by chance. She had dropped a pail outside the well, its handle snapping, the water spilling into slush. The rancher, passing on horseback, dismounted and repaired it with quiet skill, bending the metal back into shape. She thanked him softly, the child clinging to her skirts. He said little, only tipped his hat, but in the way he moved, in the way he handed back the mended pail, there was a kind of promise unspoken. He would not let her struggle alone when it was within his strength to ease the burden. That evening, snow fell in thicker sheet. The rancher sat in his cabin, staring at the fire again. The warmth touched his face, but his thoughts drifted beyond his walls. He felt the loneliness of his land press against him more than ever, a silence he had once welcomed now turning hollow. He thought of her daughter's eyes, wide with fear yet still curious, and of the mother's steady strength, carrying herself with dignity through humiliation. He had lived long enough to know that sometimes the hardest battles are not fought with guns or fists, but with endurance against cruelty. Deepened, he understood something he had not admitted before. His solitude was no longer enough. He could not remain a shadow at the edge of their suffering. A choice was stirring in him, though not yet ready to be spoken. It was as if the storm itself was waiting, holding breath, to see what kind of man he would become. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The world lay white and still, as though freshly born. But beneath that silence, conflict brewed, quiet but certain, like a river pushing unseen beneath ice. The cruel man's hand was not done rising, the town's silence not yet broken, and the rancher's resolve not yet tested. All of them stood on the edge of a winter that would demand truth, demand defiance, demand courage. For now only the child sensed it. She pressed her face against the window that morning, staring into the endless white, and whispered to herself words her mother could not hear. She whispered that she wished for someone to come. And somewhere out there, a man already had. Winter deepened, and with it the cruelty inside that house. Snow piled against doors, rattled loose shingles, made every step outdoors heavy and slow, yet the storm inside their walls was harsher still. The man's temper flared with the season, his voice cutting sharper than wind, his hand rising with less restraint. Each day the young woman carried herself with silence, her dignity her last defense, but the marks beneath her dress told a truth words could not. Her daughter watched with wide, frightened eyes, her small hands trembling whenever her father's boots struck the floor too hard. The girl's innocence was already cracked, the world teaching her too early that strength and cruelty often wore the same face. She clung to her mother at night, whispering promises she could not keep, her child's vow to stand between whip and womb if it came to that. And the mother, though aching, would hush her, stroking her hair, singing soft songs that tried to remind them both that beauty had once lived in their lives. The town did not change. Neighbors looked away, merchants sold what they always sold, saloon doors swung open to men's laughter while silence followed behind them like a ghost. People knew, but no one spoke. To interfere was to invite trouble, and trouble was heavier than snow, something most men and women preferred not to carry. But on the edge of that silence stood the rancher. He had tried to let the image fade, tried to bury it beneath work and long nights, but memory does not yield so easily. He saw her face whenever he looked into the fire. He heard the child's cry each time the wind rushed past his cabin. He knew what it was to be alone in suffering, and he could not shake the knowing that if he did nothing, he would become like the rest of the town, complicit in his quiet. The breaking point came on a night when the moon was pale and thin, its light glinting off ice like shards of glass. The man had drunk too much, his words slurred but his anger sharp as ever. He accused, he cursed, he lifted his hand not once but again and again. The young woman shielded her belly, crouched low, protecting the life inside even as blows fell upon her shoulders. The child screamed, high and piercing, her small voice cutting through the walls, through the storm, through the night itself. That cry traveled farther than sound should, as if the world itself carried it across the snow. In his cabin, the rancher rose at once, heart pounding, as though he had been waiting for it. He saddled his horse without a word, the animal's breath steaming into the cold, and rode hard through the drifts. Snow stung his face, the rains biting his gloves, but nothing slowed him. He knew where the cry had come from. The house stood dim, a lantern burning low, the air around it restless with violence. The child was outside now, bare feet in snow, wailing for someone to help. She looked small as a shadow against the whiteness, her arms lifted as if begging the sky. The rancher swung down from his horse, lifted her into his coat, and carried her through the door. Inside he found chaos. The man stood over his wife, whip in hand, fury etched deep in his face. But when his eyes met the rancher's, something shifted. Here was not another townsman to look away. Here was a figure unmoved, a man whose silence did not signal weakness but resolve. The rancher said no word. He simply stepped forward, setting the child gently down behind him, and placed himself between husband and wife. His presence filled the room like a mountain filling a valley, immovable, unyielding. The man with the whip shouted, cursed, demanded he leave, but the rancher did not move. His eyes, gray and steady, did not waver. There was no need for fists, no need for guns. The strength in him was not of noise but of stillness. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire snapping, the wind rattling the shutters. Then the man's rage faltered. He threw the whip down, spitting threats he did not believe, and stormed from the cabin. His boots thudded against the porch, then faded into the night. Silence remained. The young woman trembled, her breath unsteady, but her eyes lifted to meet the rancher's. In them was shock, weariness, and something else, a dawning recognition that not all strength destroys. The child clung to her mother's dress, peeking from behind her, her sobs softening as the room steadied around the quiet figure who had come to stand with them. The rancher lifted neither hand nor voice. He did not claim triumph, did not demand thanks. Instead, he guided them gently outside, helped them onto his horse, and led them through the night. Snow fell in heavy flakes, settling on their shoulders, but it no longer felt as bitter as before. For the first time in too long, the woman's tears were not born of pain but of release. They reached his cabin, warm with firelight, its wooden walls smelling of cedar and smoke. Inside, he offered no questions, no demands. He laid blankets near the hearth, poured warm water for washing, and stepped back, giving space. His silence spoke more than words. Here, no hand would strike, no voice would curse. Here they could breathe. The child nestled into the blankets, eyes closing against the glow of the flames. The mother sat near her, hand resting on her daughter's hair, but her gaze drifted to the rancher. She saw in him not pity, not charity, but something rarer, respect. He saw her not as broken, but as enduring, and in that recognition, something long dormant in her heart stirred faintly, like an ember catching light. Outside, the storm pressed against the cabin, but inside, a fragile peace held. Still, peace is never permanent. The man they had left behind was not one to accept shame quietly. His anger would return, sharper for being thwarted. The town's silence would be tested, and so would the rancher's resolve. But for now, in that moment, a woman bruised and weary sat by the fire with her daughter safe in her arms, and a man of few words stood nearby, watching over them. The snow outside howled, yet within those walls, hope had taken its first breath. Snow lay deep across the land when the final reckoning came. The rancher's cabin stood against the drifts, its windows glowing faintly, a refuge carved out of wilderness. Inside, the fire kept steady, its warmth spreading across the room where the young woman sat with her daughter nestled against her side. For the first time in many nights, the child's sleep was untroubled. The soft rise and fall of her breath carried the sound of safety, a sound the mother had almost forgotten. She watched the flames, her hand resting gently on her belly, the life within reminding her that the future was still waiting to be claimed. The rancher moved quietly through the space, tending the fire, setting wood by the door, checking the latch against the storm. His presence was constant but never pressing, his care shone in small, steady acts rather than grand gestures. He spoke little, but every silence he offered felt different from the silence of others. Where the town's quiet was cowardice, his was patience, a respect that gave room rather than demanded submission. Yet beneath that calm, all three knew it could not last untouched. The man she had fled, the father of her child and wielder of the whip, would not let shame settle without retaliation. His pride was too brittle, his anger too vast. He had been humiliated, and humiliation in such a man does not die in the snow. It festers, it grows, it comes back like a storm with darker clouds. It was mid-morning when hoofbeats broke the hush of the frozen world. The child woke first, clutching her mother's hand, her wide eyes betraying recognition before any words were spoken. The woman's body stiffened. She knew those hoofbeats as well as she knew the sound of the lash. The rancher rose from his chair, his jaw tightening, and stepped to the door. The man dismounted in a fury, boots crunching through snow, his coat whipping in the wind. His face was red with rage, whiskey still on his breath, his voice carrying across the yard. He shouted for his wife, demanded she return, cursed the rancher for daring to take what he claimed was his. His threats were loud, intended to draw the attention of any who lingered in town nearby. And indeed, shadows began to appear at a distance, townsfolk peering from doorways, gathering at the edge of the street, drawn by the clash they had long avoided. The rancher stepped onto the porch, coat hanging heavy, eyes steady as ever. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply stood there, a wall of calm against the storm of fury. The man below raged, spitting words like fire, but his fire found no purchase. The rancher's silence was its own kind of answer, and it was stronger than any curse. The woman emerged then, not because she wished to but because she could not hide forever. Her daughter clung to her skirts, face buried against the fabric, but her small hand gripped tightly, as though she understood the moment mattered. The mother's face was pale yet resolute. She had lived too long in shadows of fear. Now, with the rancher at her side, she found herself standing straighter. Her voice, when it came, was low but firm. She told her husband she would not return. She told him the child would not return. She told him the whip would not rise again. The man's face twisted, his rage reaching for violence, but before his hand could move, the rancher stepped down from the porch and stood between them. His presence was final, a line drawn in the snow. His voice carried only then, deep and measured, telling the man that the woman was no longer his to command, no longer his to wound. If he wished to raise his hand again, he would find it met not by silence but by resistance that would not break. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, their courage long dormant, now stirred by the defiance before them. They saw what they had refused to see, the truth of cruelty and the strength of one man standing against it. For once, silence broke not in complicity but in recognition. Their eyes bore witness, and the cruel man, for all his rage, found no ally among them. Then the rancher did something no one expected. He turned to the woman, snow drifting between them, and asked her, not with command but with quiet respect, if she would take his hand, not as charity, not as protection, but as equal. He asked if she would allow him to stand with her, not above her. In that moment, before the watching eyes of the town and the bitter glare of the man who had tormented her, he offered marriage, not as possession, but as defiance, as sanctuary, as a way to seal her freedom beyond the reach of cruelty. The young woman's breath caught. She had known only bonds that hurt, vows that silenced. Yet in his eyes she saw no hunger for power, only steady resolve. She placed her hand in his, trembling but sure, and in that gesture the crowd felt something shift. A promise was made, a union forged not in dominance but in quiet rebellion against all that sought to break them. The cruel man cursed again, but his words fell hollow. He looked around at the faces that had once turned away but now watched with disapproval. His power slipped like water through clenched fists. Rage could not hold him upright, and so he staggered back, defeated not by blows but by truth, by the strength of defiance made visible. He mounted his horse and rode away, swallowed by the snow, his figure growing smaller until it disappeared. The town remained hushed for a moment, then slowly dispersed, murmurs carrying on the wind. But in the yard, beneath falling flakes, the woman, her daughter, and the rancher stood together. It was not triumph, not joy, but a beginning, fragile, uncertain, yet undeniably real. The child looked up at the rancher, her small hand still wrapped in her mother's, and for the first time her eyes held not only fear but wonder. Inside the cabin, the fire burned steady. The rancher placed another log onto it, the the crackle filling the silence. The woman sat beside her daughter, her hand still resting in his, as though she feared letting go would undo it all. Yet in that warmth, she realized she was no longer alone. The child, drifting into sleep once more, murmured softly, as if her heart had finally found rest. The storm outside would return, as storms always do. The world would still be hard, survival still uncertain. But something had changed. Cruelty had been met, not with equal violence, but with a strength rooted in quiet defiance, in respect, in love that grew not out of passion's blaze, but out of steady flame. And as the snow fell endlessly, blanketing the earth in white, the narrator's voice would whisper to those listening by firelight, that sometimes the bravest thing is not to fight with fists, nor to endure in silence, but to stand, hand in hand, and choose a life where gentleness itself becomes defiant.